It's a rough ride aboard a 737 on descent to New Orleans.
We're getting tumbled around pretty good.
A violent thunderstorm has caught the pilots off guard.
Mayday, mayday, TACA 110. We are in the middle of a storm.
We're talking about the equivalent of an atomic bomb going off.
Everything went black. All the alarms start sounding in the cockpit.
We lost an engine.
Both engines.
With no thrust, the plane won't get far.
I don't think I will make it. I don't have any power on the engines.
38 passengers suddenly face a terrifying prospect. They will crash in minutes.
Look, that's where we're going to go in.
You got it, my friend.
Unless the crew of TACA Flight 110 can perform one of the greatest feats in the history of commercial aviation.
All right.
Mayday, mayday.
A brand new Boeing 737 is making its way through heavy thunderstorms and hail 30,000 feet above the Gulf of Mexico.
Vamos a tener mal tiempo por un buen rato.
TACA Airlines is a small family-owned operation based in El Salvador. TACA Flight 110 left Belize City less than 2 hours ago, bound for New Orleans. Among the 38 passengers,
Gracias.
no one is more eager to arrive in the U.S. than Lee Burmeister.
I'd been down to Costa Rica for about a month, and my appendix ruptured and had surgery in a small little village. It was a scary time. I was really ready to get home.
The heavy weather the crew is now coping with is a big change from earlier in the flight.
I remember that it was a very sunny day when we left Belize. Everything was going well.
Todo iba bien.
It was just like that. It was pretty, and then all of a sudden it was the blackest sky I've ever seen in the afternoon.
They're flying over the Gulf of Mexico in May. At this time of year, the weather is unpredictable. Violent storms can form in a matter of minutes.
Thunderstorms have all types of hazards in them, from the heavy rain, hail, lightning, microburst, wind shear, severe icing. We're talking about the equivalent of an atomic bomb going off. A tremendous amount of energy.
To avoid dangerous storms, the crew tracks the weather with onboard radar. But the technology has limitations.
Airborne weather radar typically operates in an X band, which is a certain wavelength and has limited power. As a matter of fact, hail is not picked up on airborne radar.
So we will sometimes get hail blowing off a storm, and yet it'll only show up as green or yellow in front of us on the weather radar, not as the heart of a red thunderstorm. And unfortunately, this is one of the reasons we have to try to stay as far away from thunderstorms as we can.
Captain Carlos Dardanau was born to fly. At just 29, he is the third generation in a family of pilots.
Anti-ice on.
Since I was a little child, I remember that I was dreaming on being a pilot and being around airplanes all the time.
Captain Dardanau has had to overcome tremendous obstacles to earn his wings. 6 years earlier, in 1982, he was flying for a small general aviation company.
I was doing a little air taxi business around the country.
El Salvador was consumed by a civil war, and Dardanau found himself caught in the crossfire.
At a little grass runway airport, I was shot by guerrillas in the face.
Badly wounded, he managed to fly his passengers to safety.
We just take off, and I stayed really low between trees, and I flew 20 minutes back to the main airport.
The brush with death cost him his left eye.
I was shot over here, the bullet went through.
But Dardanot did not give up on his dream. Despite his impaired vision, he went on to become a certified commercial pilot.
TACA 110 runway 28, final approach course, continue inbound.
Descend at pilot's discretion, maintain 4,000.
Thank you, sir. TACA 110, 4,000.
First Officer Dionisio Lopez has more than 12,000 flight hours. He and Dardanot have flown together many times. Captain Arturo Soleil is a flight instructor with TACA Airlines. He's on board today to observe the performance of this new plane. A 737-300 series, the jet was delivered to TACA Airlines just 2 weeks ago.
This hill is going to scratch the paint.
We were really worried about the paint coming off the airplane because this is a brand new airplane in the company.
The 300 is the latest in the world's most successful line of twin-engine passenger jets. It's more aerodynamic than its predecessor. It also features a new state-of-the-art engine design.
When you pick up a new jetliner worth millions and millions and fly it home with a brand new paint job and everything is nice and new, it's not just a thrill for the crew, it's a thrill for the airline too, especially a smaller one like TACA. This was a big, big deal.
50 kilometers from the New Orleans airport, the plane begins its final descent.
It feels like you hit a wall. There was severe turbulence in the cockpit with a lot of noise, with ice hitting the airplane.
Por favor, permanezca sentado con el cinturón de seguridad puesto.
It was awful. Lots of lightning, and the plane was having a pretty rough trip. We were getting tumbled around pretty good.
As the flight attendants take their seats.
Flight attendants, please take your seats.
Suddenly, less than 17,000 feet from the ground, the flight becomes all the more terrifying.
It was very strange because it had never happened to me before. The lights had never gone off during turbulence.
Everything went black. All the alarms start sounding in the cockpit. All the instruments went out. So I hit the throttles a couple of times, trying to just go to basics, control the airplane.
We lost power on the engines.
Then I find out that we didn't have any power.
I've got nothing.
The plane has enough speed to glide, but not for long. It will rapidly lose altitude as it does. No power also means no electricity for all of the onboard systems. In the New Orleans control tower, Flight 110 disappears from radar.
TACA 110, approach, say altitude. TACA 110, this is New Orleans approach control. How do you hear?
Without power, communication with the plane is now impossible.
It's really quiet. There aren't any engine sounds. There aren't any lights. It feels like you're in a dark room without any power.
In less than a minute, the 737 drops almost 1,000 feet. It continues to fall.
We are dropping at 1,500 feet per minute.
And without power, there is no way to restart the engines.
Well, we knew we didn't have much time to try to find out where to land or what kind of emergency landing we're going to have, or that we're going to have the engine started again.
The altimeter and attitude indicator have backup battery power. Nothing else is working.
The DFU started.
The APU, or Auxiliary Power Unit, is a backup generator that provides emergency power to vital systems. But starting it takes time. And with each passing second, TACA Flight 110 falls closer and closer to the water below.
It was very quiet. You could hear the hail hitting the plane. I was thinking that this was it, that it's going down, and this is my last day.
Lovers, watch the gauges.
Without power to the engines, the state-of-the-art jetliner has become a 43-ton glider.
We were wondering if we can get the APU going really fast. You know, you're gliding down in the middle of the thunderstorm, trying to get the power going.
The view's up and running.
Y cuando regresaron las luces,
When the lights came back on, I was relieved. I thought it was something temporary. No big deal.
pero que no va a pasar para más.
The APU is now providing emergency power to the plane's systems. But the engines are still not running. To fire up the powerful turbofan engines, the crew must follow the procedure for a complete engine restart.
Fast to idle, and fuel levers off.
The APU can generate the power to restart the engines, but it takes time.
It takes like 30 seconds or so, but it feels like your life.
Columbia Day to New Orleans. Get us out of this storm and onto our runway.
Mayday, Mayday, TACA 110.
We are in the middle of the storm, sir. We need vectors to the runway now, sir. We lost an engine.
Both engines.
Both engines, sir. Both engines.
Understand?
Both engines, TACA 110, roger.
The controller knows he needs to get the plane on the ground as soon as possible, even if it means sending it to another airport.
TACA 110, roger. Turn left heading 280. Vectors to Navy calendar runway 22.
Flight 110 is still 32 kilometers from New Orleans. The stricken plane has a better chance of landing at a US naval base 27 kilometers away. But the plane will not make it to any airport unless the crew gets the engines started.
29, 30, hit it.
Only 5,000 feet from the ground, the left engine ignites.
Speed.
Okay, good job. Start working on the other one.
The plane can fly with only one engine, but both engines would be safer, especially in bad weather.
Request a vector back to New Orleans.
Okay, we have one engine back on. Request vectors to New Orleans.
TACA 110, Wilco, fly heading 290.
Vector around the thunderstorms to your right.
Meanwhile, Captain Soleil is taking the steps to fire up the second engine.
Here comes the other one. And here comes the other one. Speed.
All right.
And you got both of them.
With both engines back, it appears the crisis is over.
Okay, sir, we have both engines back now. We really appreciate what you've done for us. We are going to go down to 310.
For the engines to come back on, it really didn't make anybody feel that much better. We are still in a mess.
Look, I don't feel any power. Why don't I feel any power?
Something's wrong. The engines appear to be running, but they're not providing any thrust.
Sucker's not starting.
Then the gauges show that the engines are overheating. They're burning up from the inside. The risk of a catastrophic engine fire now leaves Dardanot no choice. He must do something no pilot would ever want to do. Shut down both engines for good. Once again, the plane is without power, and falling fast.
We knew that we don't have any possibility to restart the engines, and then we had to start looking for some place to land.
The plane is quickly closing in on 3,000 feet. At the rate it's dropping, it won't make it to New Orleans.
Okay, where do I put this thing down?
Visibility begins to improve when the plane breaks through the storm clouds. But it's still raining, and Dardanelle has less than 3 minutes to find a place to land.
I was seeing just swampy land all over the place.
New Orleans is surrounded by canals and lakes. The city is protected by a system of levees, man-made barriers designed to prevent flooding. It's no place to try to land a 737.
We don't have power on the engines.
TACA 110, I'm going to vector you to Lakefront Airport. You're only 11 miles from Lakefront.
I don't think I will make it. I don't have any
Power in the engines. I guess we'll have to go down.
We're going to declare an emergency.
We're gonna have to decide where to put this thing.
TACA 110,
Do you have visual reference to the ground at this time?
Yes, sir.
TACA 110,
there is an interstate highway directly ahead of you at 12 o'clock and
7 miles.
Let's see where it is.
Landing on a highway may be Dardanelle's only option.
It was probably a possibility, but you always know that the freeways are full of cars. I said, no way I'm going to try to land in the highway because we'll kill many more people. So that was not our option, really.
11 years earlier, a Southern Airways flight facing a similar emergency was forced to land on a highway in Georgia. The crash landing killed 9 people on the ground and 63 people on board the plane.
I don't think we're going to be able to make it there.
You're 6 miles away from Lakefront Airport. Can you make it there?
No, sir, we're at 2,000 feet and losing altitude.
The crew only has one option left.
I guess I'm gonna have to make a ditching here, sir.
They must take their chances and put the plane down on the water.
TACA 110, roger. Whatever you need to do, sir.
And that was about the last communication with the tower. Then we were like 1,500 feet when that was going on.
This is New Orleans Tower. We have an inbound 737 probable ditching. 45 souls on board.
The Coast Guard is immediately deployed. Dardanelle plans to put the plane down in the canal directly ahead of him.
Okay. There.
Put it down softly.
It was kind of the feeling of everyone on the plane that we weren't going to get out of this. It was a doomsday kind of feeling. And this was it.
Oh, excuse me, what's going on?
Lo siento, pero no tengo más información en este momento.
The stewardess's body language, I didn't even have to understand what they were saying. You could just see them in distress.
The 737 can only stay in the air for another minute. As Dardanelle looks for a safe stretch of canal to drop the plane in, another option appears.
Look at that one over there.
And then Lopez saw the levee parallel to the canal that we were making the approach on.
We put it down on the grass?
Yes, boss.
The levee is much shorter and narrower than a runway, but it looks safer than the water.
That's where we're going to go in?
You got it, my friend.
They will have to act fast to get there.
Prepare the cabin.
No te da tiempo.
You don't even have time to think about being scared. So I can't say I was scared. We had to start preparing the cabin.
Empezar a trabajar en la cabina.
La cabeza entre las rodillas y agarren los tobillos.
I had to assume crash position, and it was really difficult for me because I had just had surgery.
You're kidding me.
And I had stitches going up the middle of my stomach.
Stitches. Operation.
Passengers only have seconds to prepare.
Los pasajeros se tenían que quitar los zapatos, se tenían que...
The passengers had to take off their shoes, their jewelry. They had to put their shoes under the seat in front of them. So we went through the whole emergency checklist.
Teníamos que trabajar.
Air traffic control can no longer pick up the low-flying 737 on radar. The controller asks other planes to look for it.
6 to Kilo Alpha. If you could check your east just slightly
To the south 3 to 4 miles, we lost an aircraft down there.
737. If you could let me know what you see.
Roger. Kilo Alpha to 6. I'll see what I can do.
I felt scared when I got back to my seat. That's the moment when I really got scared.
Okay, put the gear down. All right.
But Captain Dardanot is still flying towards the water.
Well, the levee was parallel to my right.
To have any hope of landing on the levee, he needs to make a sudden and dramatic course correction. That requires a risky maneuver known as a side slip.
So we just had to do a little bit side slip to get into position to make a perfect landing.
It's a move meant for small planes and gliders, not a 43-ton Boeing 737. But it's a risk he has to take.
Agarrate, papá.
I prayed. I was in disbelief that this was happening.
Only 700 feet separate the plane from the ground. Without engines, the pilots have no thrust reversers to slow the plane when it touches down. Dardanot has an additional challenge. With only one eye, he's unable to gauge depth as he speeds towards the narrow, rain-soaked strip of grass.
Oh, God. Oh, God. I was prepared for the plane to blow up and explode. I was prepared for a tragic event and mentally had said goodbye to my family.
This is it.
There's a high cement wall in front of the levee and a steep embankment on the left. There may not be enough room to land.
Watch out for the wing on that side.
I see it. Come on. Aquí te tengo, baby. Aquí te tengo.
We touched down with one wheel and the other one.
Was it a hard landing? Yes. If the seatbelt snapped, we would have flown through the plane, for sure.
On the soggy grass, the plane is in danger of skidding off the levee into the water.
I was trying just to control the airplane, not to hit the brakes and not to lose the airplane at the last minute, you know. The spoilers were out. So we were just thinking, okay, we make it, we make it, we make it.
Very good. Very good. Very good, sorry. Very good, my friend.
It was surprise.
It was a hard landing, but it was a nice landing, just to be alive.
El aterrizaje fue espectacular. El avión.
The landing was spectacular. The plane landed so smoothly. There wasn't even a bit of turbulence.
No hubo ninguna ni media turbulencia.
A perfect landing.
Perfecto.
And that was, I think, the most beautiful landing that I ever made.
Cuando yo vi mi...
When I looked out my window, there was no fire. So I immediately opened the door and deployed the slide.
Salió el tobogán.
Rápido, por la salida más cercana.
They told us to get off the plane, that the plane was going to blow up.
The New Orleans controller has no idea what has become of TACA Flight 110. Another aircraft relays the news to the tower.
Kilo Alpha to 6. Everything looks okay. Looks like you did a pretty good job.
They made it. You're not going to believe where they are.
For the first time in history, A 737 without any engines has landed safely outside of an airport. Now investigators must find out why the sophisticated engines on a brand new jetliner failed in mid-flight. Pilots call this a dead stick landing, a landing with no engines. As it turns out, TACA 110 has landed on NASA property. This is the Michoud facility, where they manufacture parts for the space shuttle.
The evacuation was quick. We got out of the plane quickly. We slid down the chutes. I got to the top of the levee, and there were some nurses that were on the plane. And they looked at my stitches and everything.
No major injuries, just one person that had an operation, but she's okay. Where were you headed? To New Orleans.
And soon after, an ambulance came, put me on a stretcher, and took me to the hospital.
You have to thank God.
That's right, yes.
And also our captain, because he kept the calm.
That's right.
I'm going to talk to
Now that's not something you see every day.
Within hours of the emergency, investigators arrive and begin examining the damaged plane.
To end up with a jetliner sitting on a levee, having landed there, being perfectly intact, is almost an unbelievable sight. It's beyond incredible.
There's a couple of questions for you, but first thing I'd like to say is, nice landing. So, tell me, when did the engine trouble start?
Investigators meet with the crew right away. They want to know exactly what was happening when the engines flamed out.
We were descending through 16.5 when both our engines flamed out at the same time.
That both of them coming apart at the same time is an infinitesimal possibility.
This plane was powered by one of the most advanced and widely used jet engines on Earth, the CFM56. It powers not only the Boeing 737, but Airbus and military planes as well.
The CFM56 is just a marvel of current engineering aeronautically. There are thousands and thousands of them out there, and they almost never ever fail.
But 2 CFM56s had failed on this one plane alone. Investigators desperately need to know why.
I haven't flown through too many storms that intense.
They turn their attention to the weather conditions.
It's considered a very rare occurrence for engines to have flamed out in flight. And therefore, the concentration was on what possibility would cause this. Is there an environmental effect, since they were flying through rain and hail?
Tell me about the storm.
The winds were fierce. There was so much rain and hail, we could barely see out the window.
Dents in the fuselage revealed that the plane was struck by hail almost an inch in diameter. If the hail was strong enough to damage the exterior of the plane, investigators wonder if it crippled the engines as well. A turbofan engine is made up of a system of fans and blades. A large fan brings air into the engine. A series of blades compresses the incoming air, which mixes with fuel to ignite, spinning the turbines deep inside the engine.
The first thing you look for is to find the parts and then look in the front and the back of the engine to determine if there's damage that might explain something has gone in the engine or something has broken inside the engine.
To peer inside the engine, they use a borescope.
This is where you put the little TV camera on the end of a scope of some sort. You can look in the internal hot section of the engine and see what they could see.
No hail damage to the compressor that I can see. Keep going deeper. Let's see what's at the center.
But the turbines deep inside the engine are charred.
This. Turbines are almost completely melted.
When the engine overheats, if the overheat is allowed to occur long enough, then it will cause melting of the turbine blades.
So when did you get the temperature warning?
The engines started to overheat right after we started them.
And the damage to the turbine, which is the melting of the blades, means that you can no longer produce thrust out of that engine.
The charred turbines do not explain why the engine stopped working in the first place. For some reason, Flight 110's engines had quit, restarted, and only then burned up. But before the search for answers can continue, investigators are confronted with another problem. The plane is starting to sink.
It can't stay here much longer. Maybe NASA has some ideas.
The levee was never meant to support 43,000 kilograms.
A jetliner has an awful lot of weight on a very small footprint. You leave a plane there for 2 or 3 days, you may have it mired up to its hubcaps.
There was barely enough room to land the plane on the levee. Getting the plane off of it could be even more challenging.
You've got really 3 ways to get this airplane out of there. One is to fly it out, secondly, to disassemble it, or third, put it on a barge. But it's not as easy as it sounds.
Disassembling the plane could cause more damage.
Do you think we can fly it off?
The decision is made. They'll attempt to take off and fly the plane to New Orleans.
The very first problem of getting the airplane ready to fly was getting the engines to the point of reliability, which meant they had to replace the right engine. It was just cooked. It was too far gone. Left engine was probably going to need to be overhauled, but they could fly it out with that.
After replacing the right engine, they bring in test pilots to get the plane off the ground and to the airport 24 kilometers away in New Orleans.
It's a good, safe operation that we're doing here today. We can accelerate up to virtually to takeoff speed, and then if we decided to stop, why, we could stop the airplane.
With no passengers and very little fuel to weigh the plane down, it reaches takeoff speed in just 365 meters. The investigation at the emergency landing site comes to a dramatic end.
In most scenarios in which an airplane comes down in the wrong place but is still intact, you probably never get it out that way. This just happened to be amazing luck.
Hey guys.
Investigators must now try to figure out why the engines failed in mid-flight. If rain caused them to shut down, thousands of other planes are at risk.
This was an incredible situation because these engines are just too reliable. Did they go through a thunderstorm? Well, that's not supposed to do it, so what happened?
The CFM56 engines are designed to withstand a heavy rainstorm. Most water is diverted away from the core while in flight. Whatever makes it inside should evaporate or drain from the engine.
The engines were sent back to the GE test facility in Ohio, where they have the test facilities that can recreate water ingestion testing.
If some hidden design flaw caused the engines to fail, investigators need to find it. They hope water ingestion testing can provide some answers.
Once they got these engines in the shop and started testing them, the very first thing was to go to the FAA standard, the way FAA had tested them in the past and what had been approved.
Okay, let's see what they can handle.
You basically spray water from nozzles into the inlet of the engine. And the amount of water you adjust in percentage to the amount of air to simulate flight conditions.
Despite rigorous water testing, the engine does not flame out.
Like we thought, wasn't the rain.
Nothing went wrong. The engine continued to run. So obviously something else had happened.
So they needed to examine this in much more detail. Was there something more severe about the weather?
We lost an engine.
Both engines.
Both engines, sir.
Investigators study all available data on the storm that somehow brought down TACA Flight 110.
That was more than a thunderstorm, it was a hailstorm.
In the case of the TACA, we had basically a frontal system to the north, some very strong winds in the vertical producing several hail events. And in the southern latitudes, you don't typically see too many hailstorms. So it was abnormal.
The engines are designed to ingest water, but investigators are unsure if hail acts differently from water inside the engine.
They never thought about hail getting into the core.
Hail is only created in a thunderstorm. It basically starts as a raindrop. It goes up above the freezing level, freezes, becomes a piece of ice. Then as it gets heavier, drops back down below the freezing level, coats another layer of water around it, and gets back into the updraft again, brought to higher altitudes, and refreezes. So hail is multiple layers of ice that forms on a particle.
Investigators learned that the engines were designed to withstand the impact from hailstones of a certain size.
The FAA standards called for a mixture of hail sizes of 1-inch and 2-inch diameter balls.
Some of the hail TACA 110 encountered was smaller than that. Those smaller pieces of hail could make their way through the fan and compressor blades, accumulating deep inside the engine, where they would melt.
Hail was considered to not be a factor in the center core, but if it had been, what would it look like?
Investigators calculate the amount of hail that could have entered the engine core. They then estimate the volume of water the melting ice would have produced.
That's substantially more water.
Investigators want to know if this excess water overwhelmed the engines and caused the failure.
Okay, let's try more water and see what happens.
They perform another water ingestion test, this time adding even more water to account for the hail inside the engines.
So if they used enough water to emulate that, maybe they could make it fail. Well, they tried using a high speed on the engine, and still it wouldn't fail.
Okay, what are we missing?
Or whether there's something unique about the engine operation itself that might have contributed to the engine losing power.
Engine performance figures from the flight data recorder give investigators a new lead.
Just before the flameout, engine power was down to 35%.
TACA 110 runway 28, final approach course, continue inbound, descend at pilot's discretion, maintain 4,000.
Thank you, sir. TACA 410, 4,000.
They just started their descent.
Thank you, sir. TACA 110, 4,000.
As the plane began its final approach to New Orleans, the engines automatically reduced power to slow down for their descent. At a lower power setting, the engines may not have been able to handle as much water.
We've been testing everything in accordance with the normal FAA methodologies at high speed on the engines, but these guys were in descent to New Orleans.
They repeat the test, this time with less power to the engines.
So we want to see what happens when we add the same amount of water, but with the engines powered down to 35%, okay?
The big aha moment was when they realized that it was the speed of the engine that was managing to get the engine through the ingestion of as much water as they could throw at it, and presumably as much hail. But when the engine went down to idle, that's when they managed to find the key. That's when the engine couldn't handle it.
Well, now we know what happened. Bad timing.
And that test gave a completely different result.
Investigators have discovered why the engines flamed out.
It showed something that no one understood at the time, because in all the testing and all the logic that had gone into it, they hadn't taken into account the slow speeds on the engine on descent.
At the lower speeds, the hail, having a significant velocity and momentum, can actually see an opening between the fan blades. And it's able to get through the fan blades and directly into the core.
The engines filled with hail and water and flamed out. For investigators, only one mystery remains.
Look, don't feel any power.
What went wrong after the TACA crew restarted their engines?
The sucker's not started.
Why did they overheat and fail? When the engines on the 737 flamed out, the crew knew they had to act fast.
We've lost power on the engines.
To have any hope of restoring engine power, they first needed to get the APU running.
Get the APU started.
Since the engines were no longer spinning, they had stopped ingesting air and water, but a successful restart was far from guaranteed.
If you do not have all the proper conditions, you can get what's called a hot start, which means that you have too much fuel for the amount of air going into it, and the flame will now migrate into the turbine, where it could overheat it.
After studying the engine data from the flight recorder, investigators conclude that the overheating and ultimate failure of the engines was in fact due to a hot start.
Mayday, mayday, TACA 110. We lost an engine.
Both engines.
Both engines, sir. Both engines.
With his engines flooded with fuel and no time to properly drain them, Dardanot hit the ignition switch.
If it didn't get all the timing correctly, then this is what's going to happen. You're going to get a hot start. I can't be critical of a pilot in that condition. That aircraft is coming down.
Rain and hail from an intense storm crippled a modern passenger jet and nearly led to disaster. Investigators must find a way to make sure it never happens again.
One of the beauties of aviation and aviation safety is when we find there's a problem, everybody works together to solve it. And in this case, the problem indicated a need for an engine change, not a complete design overhaul, but just a few tweaks. But that was done almost immediately, much to the credit of everybody involved.
The shape of the engine nose cone and the spacing of the fan blades are modified in order to better deflect hail away from the core. Also, additional bleed doors are added to drain more water from the engine.
That sort of thing hasn't happened again, and there are thousands and thousands of these engines flying every day for hours and hours and hours.
Within a year of the incident, 737-300s around the world are retrofitted with the upgrades. The plane involved in the daring landing is back in service within a month.
Look at that one over there. That's where we're going to go in.
You got it, my friend.
The crew's actions on Flight 110 are legendary in the aviation world.
The decision-making at the very end, when they were going to put it in the canal and saw an opportunity to put it on dry ground and did so, that was superlative. It was the decision-making.
Investigators credit the calm nerves and determination of Captain Dardanot.
Watch out for the wing on that side.
I see it.
For avoiding what could have been a fatal disaster. Captain Carlos Dardanot is dubbed a hero in the media.
Passengers that day were overjoyed. Dardanot and his crew kept the calm, and because of that, 45 people who rode that plane are alive today.
Today, the Dardanot family tradition continues. Carlos's son and daughter have followed in their father's footsteps, both becoming pilots.
At the beginning, I was mad when I was shot. I lost part of my vision, and then I had this accident that everything went well. And 20 years later, I have a career, I have a good life, and life is for a reason is for life.
And you didn't need to wait for a command in this situation.
There was fire, and I shouted to Suzanne, "Fire on the wing."
She ran back to my exit
and saw Suzanne standing there, getting ready to open the door, and just saw the door crumple like cheap tinfoil. And I thought, oh my God, we're trapped.
I was staring at the door, and I yelled, "Unfasten your seatbelts, remove your shoes, leave everything, come this way." And as I stared at the door, a jagged hole seemed to open up in the roof over the door.
And the next thing I knew, I was outside that. I don't know how I got out there.
Joan was standing there yelling, "Suzanne, take my hand."
And I was standing above the level of the door on fuselage rubble pieces. And I leaned down and said to Suzanne, "Give me your hand."
She grabbed me out with one hand. I mean, I don't know how she lifted me.
And then we were standing up on top of almost on top of this airplane. And I thought, it's really a long ways down. If we jump, we're going to break our legs.
We were on debris. It was like ice flows, big chunks of fuselage kind of moving all around.
The engines were starting to disintegrate already. We could hear them disintegrating and throwing metal.
I lost Joan's hand very quickly, so I jumped. And it seemed like the leap from a second-story building.
The captain, he elected to jump down in the first-class section of the airplane. And when he hit the first-class floor, the floor collapsed and he fell on down into the cargo area. It was so hot that the oxygen bottles exploded and burned him very badly, as a matter of fact.
It was a survival mode that kicked in, and it was just get out of that airplane. I didn't stop to think about how it happened.
I went to where the door would have been, and I left my wife seated. And then it came to me, what am I doing? Where's my wife? So I turned around, and she was coming, and I said, I will jump and try and break your fall.
My husband was sitting to my right, and I undid his seatbelt and kind of pushed him out of his seat to get him moving. And we headed for the door that was closest to us. And it was engulfed in flames, and there was no way to exit that way. I looked over, and at some point, someone had opened the other door, which was amazing to me. And I just yelled over here and headed toward the door on the other side, which was, again, the wing door.
In the haste to get out of the burning plane, Karen became separated from her husband. He died in the flames.
I immediately thought it was total destruction. It never dawned on me that I would make it. But I thought, hey, do something. Don't just sit there, do something. I just went over the seat backs, and I'm not that athletic really, but I went over 3 rows of seats. One man was sitting there looking like I need help, but I couldn't help him.
When KLM hit us, all communication stopped. The tower called and couldn't get any response from either the KLM or ourselves. There was an airplane in the holding pattern right above Tenerife. Called the tower and said, I see smoke and wreckage on your runway.
Rodriguez approach Sterling 105. We're downwind from runway 30 and something's glowing on the field. Looks like a fire. Are you aware of any fire?
Shit, this can't be true! Come on, come on! Come on, come on!
He hits the emergency warning. After KLM hit us, he went on down the runway and hit on the runway 1,500 feet down, closer to the tower. So when the fire truck and the ambulance came out, they got to him first. So no one came to us for quite a while. As a matter of fact, I remember thinking, I wonder why somebody hasn't gotten out here to help us.
It's complete bedlam. In the fog, the fire trucks don't know where to go. When they eventually find the Dutch plane, it's hopeless. Everyone's dead. And the whole time, they don't realize there's a second plane a short distance away, hidden in the mist, with people waiting to be saved. It's another 20 minutes before the Pan Am plane is discovered. Only 20% of the Pan Am passengers get out alive, and most of them are gathered on the left wing, which has somehow miraculously remained intact.
The entire left wing of the airplane was covered with passengers. And it turned out there were probably 45 to 50 passengers out on that wing.
I've never asked anybody how high the wing is from the ground on a 747, but it looks to be a very long ways.
And I cut open my head and fractured my foot. My wife jumped after me, and she said, "I cannot walk." And I dragged her on her side for probably a block and a half away from the plane.
The motors were going full tilt, and I didn't want to get over where the motors were, so I sat down by the body of the plane. I had no comprehension at that moment that I would be jumping off the wing and
In the debris, you knew there were trapped passengers and people, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to help because the airplane was collapsing in on people.
Only one door was opened by a crew member, and that was one of the black flight attendants who did that. And she lost her life when the engine disintegrated and debris hit her. And I thought if we could just walk around to the other side of the plane, we would find all of the passengers and our other fellow crew members, which of course wasn't the case.
Even 20 minutes after the disaster, the controllers in the tower still have no idea how serious things are.
Departing aircraft. All departures are suspended until advised. Hello.
I'll get local fire out of here. Notify the ambulance. We have an emergency. We need every vehicle they've got.
What have we done? This can't be our fault. I told him to clear the taxiway.
When I got out on the ground, I could hear people screaming and yelling and all. Within about 5 minutes, you heard absolutely nothing. There was no noise at all, just the airplane burning. I asked one of our medical directors later on what he calls that, and he said that when you have a fire that hot and that much of a fire, it consumes all of the oxygen in there, and people basically suffocate.
I felt so responsible because I couldn't take care of my passengers, and so helpless in looking back and knowing that there's nothing you can do. You can't get back in the aircraft. There's no way to get in it, and it's all on fire.
Of the KLM plane, very little remains. It had continued flying for another 400 meters before slamming into the ground. The 55 tons of fuel it had taken on ensured that everyone on board died in the fiery explosion.
It was personal vehicles, cars and trucks that seemed to come onto the grass and gather up people.
About 75% of our surviving passengers got to the hospital in taxicabs.
It was a wild, crazy ride as we were going to the hospital. The skin was hanging on both hands because I had received burns, but it hadn't affected my eyes.
I had blood all over me, and I walked up to somebody and said, "I'm a doctor, can I help?" And the guy that I said it to had the oddest look on his face, just this very wan smile, and he just shook his head, and then I immediately went into a coma.
Word soon gets out. And in the hours that follow, the international press begin to arrive, and the first news is flashed around the world.
Rescue workers are still going through the wreckage of the 2 jetliners this morning in the Canary Islands. They're looking for the bodies of victims in this worst accident in aviation history. 2 jumbo jetliners, 747s, collided on the ground at the airport at Santa Cruz de Tenerife yesterday morning.
One was a Pan Am charter from Los Angeles that picked up more people in New York before flying to the Canaries. The other was a KLM charter from Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
They set up a morgue in one of the hangars, and it was huge, and they had all of the nearly 600 bodies in that particular hangar, or temporary morgue.
The death toll rises to 583 people, nearly twice as big as any previous accident. And then everyone begins asking the same questions. How and why could 2 state-of-the-art airliners smash into each other on the same runway? Very soon, a whole army of investigators begins arriving from the 3 countries involved, Spain, Holland, and the United States. Under the rules that govern this sort of thing, they all have a right to be there, but that doesn't mean they're going to get along. In Spain, the military still runs everything, including aviation. When the American team from the National Transportation Safety Board arrives, the Spanish general in charge won't even let them into the room.
I sneaked in, and I went to the general and told him, the general, my name is Luis Carmona. I represent the U.S. government, the NTSB, and I am here to participate in the investigation. He answered back to me, I represent the king, and you get out. So as I was walking out, he looked at me again, and he said, hey, you don't look American. And I told him, well, yes, I am an American, but I was born in Cuba. And he said, well, so did I. I was also born in Cuba. So he turned around and he asked me questions and asked me to bring my team in, and we started doing the accident investigation then.
The investigators discover the chain of coincidences that had led remorselessly to the deaths of 583 people. If any one of them had not occurred, neither would the accident. The first had nothing to do with airplanes, a terrorist bombing perpetrated by a small group fighting for their independence. Their intent was to create publicity for their cause. In that, they certainly succeeded.
There are 2 bombs in the terminal. You have 10 minutes to save as many lives as you wish.
The airport is closed. Divert to Los Oleos Airport via Tenerife VOR. Descent flight level 250.
Because of the bomb, all air traffic was rerouted to Los Rodeos Airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife. But it's a small regional airfield with only 1 runway. A 747 can land there. The runway is long enough, but that's all. The airport is ill-equipped and unable to handle that amount of planes or people.
Lima Tango 107, you are clear to descend to flight level 80.
Subject 282, switch to ground now.
Contact standby for taxi clearance. KLM 4805, clear to land runway 30. Pan Am 1736.
Pan Am 1736, short final.
As luck would have it, this tidal wave of traffic happens on a Sunday afternoon when there are just 2 controllers on duty. They're good, but not used to handling as many airplanes as on that day. Big airplanes that need lots of room to park. They are confronted with an enormous jigsaw puzzle.
We'll be here all night, you know that, right?
Or you can go out there and pave us another runway.
Meanwhile, in the KLM cockpit, the stress is mounting.
Any idea of how much longer we've got before we need to get other crew down to take over?
Yeah, well...
KLM had recently introduced new company rules which handed out severe penalties for pilots who exceeded their flying hours.
What happens if we go over the civil and company time limits?
Well, you get hung out to dry. You lose your license, your career, everything.
The KLM plane has to get away before 5:30 that afternoon or abandon the flight. Hundreds of passengers would then have to be found hotels on this small island. A new crew would have to be flown in from Amsterdam. The expense would be enormous.
Willem, since we're trapped in here until the passengers get back, we might as well take on some fuel.
But that seemingly simple decision seals the fate of everyone aboard the KLM. Refueling not only delays him for half an hour and the Pan Am stuck behind him, it makes the KLM plane so heavy it'll be unable to lift off and clear the Pan Am plane on the runway. The half-hour delay has another effect. During that time, the weather changes abruptly. Los Rodeos is an unusual airport. It's on a plateau high in the hills.
Los Rodeos Airport is at 2,000 feet elevation, and the normal clouds in that area, they stay about 2,000 feet. So when the wind blows the clouds over the airport, it closes the airport. The visibility goes to zero, and it goes on and off all the time.
Unfortunately, for an airport that's constantly lost in fog, Los Rodeos is ill-equipped to deal with it. It has no ground radar so that controllers can see where the planes are. In fact, the facilities are downright primitive.
When he was not, they had a person sitting in a building next to the runway, and he just took a visual measurement of the weather, and that's how the weather was checked. And that's about all.
In the fog that day, both aircraft are invisible to the controllers.
I lost them. I can't see no visual contact.
There are no runway center lights working either. Visibility is on the borderline of what is safe. In fact, as far as the Pan Am crew is concerned, it's below the legal minimum, so no aircraft can take off.
Look at it out there. I mean, this cloud just rolled right onto us. I don't think anybody has the minimums now.
But the Dutch are working to a different set of rules. The scene is all set for a disaster. What will actually trigger it? The Dutch investigators thought they'd found the reasons.
God damn it. Of all the days this has to happen, just when Spain is going to teach Hungary a lesson in football.
The controllers, they say, were listening to the football on the radio. Perhaps their minds weren't on the job. Furthermore, their bad English had confused the pilots.
Taxi into the runway.
And leave the runway third. Third to your left. Third to the left, okay.
Third, he said?
3. Third. Third to your left.
I thought he said
leave the
first.
runway third to your left. Third one, sir. 1, 2, 3. Third. Third one. 1, 2.
Good, well, that's what we need, right? The third one.
1, 2, 3.
We were listening to the controller talking to the other airplanes. We were listening to the controller giving the ATC clearances, the taxi clearances. And he spoke clear enough English for anyone, I think. So I'd have to say no, I don't think the controller was involved at all. I don't think he had any fault at all in this accident.
1736, just checking that.
That's the 45 there.
But the Dutch haven't finished yet.
Yeah, that's this one here.
Yeah, I know.
They make an even more controversial claim, one that provokes a blazing row, that the Pan Am plane had caused the accident by being on the runway when it shouldn't have been. They hadn't followed orders to turn off.
Okay, for sure.
Maybe he counts these as 3.
Oh, I like this.
They were going to taxiway 4. He was instructed to go on 3, but he had to go 4 because taxiway number 4 was the one that had 45 degrees, and it was easy for the 747 to access it.
We said, confirm which taxiway you want to take. And he says, the third on your left, 1, 2, 3, the third on your left. And here again, I still believe this. I think he had seen us go by the first one, and when he says count 3 more taxiways, the third, 1, 2, 3, we were doing exactly what we thought he meant for us to do, and I still think that's what he meant for us to do. It was the logical taxiway to take.
Whether they should have taken the third or fourth exit became largely irrelevant anyway, because it became clear that Captain Van Zanten had made one of the most elementary mistakes a pilot can make. He'd taken off without permission.
We have 700 meters visibility here now.
Wait a minute. We don't have ATC clearance.
I know that. Go ahead, ask.
KLM 4805 is now ready for takeoff. We're waiting for ATC clearance.
KLM 4805, you're clear to the Papa Beacon.
The KLM is given its ATC clearance, which is simply the route it must follow after takeoff. Now, it must wait for permission to take off.
325 radial at Las Palmas VOR.
Roger, sir. We're cleared to the Papa Beacon, flight level 90.
Right turn out 040 until intercepting the 325. We're
going.
But why didn't his crew stop him?
It's very difficult for a co-pilot or a flight engineer to tell the captain, hey, look, you missed something.
Tenerife exposed a problem that had long existed in commercial air travel. The pilot was regarded, and often regarded himself, as God.
The captain is always right. He's never wrong.
No junior officer was ever going to contradict the airline's top pilot, the man who'd given him his license.
Panam 1736, report runway cleared.
Did you clear that? What do you say?
Is it to clear the Panam?
Oh, yes.
Captain Van Zanten, highly stressed, knowing that he has to take off or abandon the flight. His crew, aware that he's done wrong but frightened to tell him. Disaster is now inevitable.
God damn. Come.
The official report is written by Spain. It blames the accident on Captain Van Zanten's decision to take off without permission. The Dutch refuse to accept it. They publish their own report, blaming language difficulties and the general confusion at Los Rodeos.
What I learned from the Tenerife accident is that regardless of how well qualified, experienced, professional, and exact professional you are, okay, accidents, as long as human beings are involved, accidents can always take place.
The insurers pay out a record sum, $2 billion in today's money. As for the survivors, the images of the 27th of March will always be with them. They've just learned to live with them, that's all.
And whenever I have friends that travel, I tell them, make sure you know where your exit is, make sure you read all that stuff, know how to get out of the airplane. I mean, those are important things.
I never had nightmares. I had only dreams about being helpless and being at an airport behind a big, thick window and watching an airplane take off and knowing that it was going to crash and wanting to shout out, but there was this big, thick glass window. You're just helpless, and that's what you feel, is this, because our responsibility is to take care of everyone, and that's what we want to do, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't save them.
The loss of my husband had a tremendous impact on my life, on my son's life, on my extended family's lives. It was huge.
And you can see how strange life is, you know, that things like that happen, that you get off and they go on, and perhaps if the plane left a minute later, it wouldn't have happened.
I think it brought home to me how quickly you can leave this life and how everyone should enjoy life every and each day as much as you possibly can.
Well, after the crash, I decided to start a family. I thought maybe I will stay home and have children.
I thought, you know, my friends have died, and if I let myself sit in this little apartment, it's going to be as if I'm curled up and died, and that's not fair to them. I can honor them best by living a life, a full life, and not being afraid.
I am blessed because I do not have any horror left over from the accident.
I felt ashamed the first while. And a long time I thought, you know, I wish I died, because I felt very bad.
I was scared for quite a while after the crash, but I knew if I flew with Joan, she would pull me out again.
I had to quit the NTSB. I didn't retire. I felt so bad that I became ill. I had to go to a doctor and get some medication because I got sick.
I went back to Tenerife, my wife and I had a driver take me out to the airport and show me the runway, and I looked at it all. I did it all over again. And then I went back and took the Golden Odyssey steamship from the Royal Cruise Line to sort of complete the situation which I had missed.